Picture this. I remember the sound before the sight, the brittle hiss of snow scraping against a hut's wooden walls. Inside, the air trembled with cold. I was only a shadow then, watching a woman press a glowing stone to her baby's chest so it wouldn't turn blue before sunrise. Her hands shook, but not from fear. From exhaustion, the kind born of keeping warmth alive when the world no longer cooperates. Now picture another world. Far to the south, the same night unfolded beneath a ceiling of carved gold. A queen walked barefoot across marble that still remembered the desert heat. I could almost hear her footsteps, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone who has never known cold. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet their survival depended on the same secret. That's where my journey began, in the fragile space between breath and belief, tracing the ember that links peasant to monarch, servant to sovereign. Tonight, we travel from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to uncover the secret world of queens and servants. Good evening, traveler. If you're hearing my voice, then the night has already begun to fold itself around you. Maybe the city outside your window is still awake, sirens, laughter, the slow sigh of passing cars. Or maybe you're in a quieter place, where the only sound is the pulse of your own breath. Wherever you are, pause. Dim the lights. Let the room become smaller, safer. The kind of darkness that doesn't hide things but holds them gently in its hands. I like to imagine you there, leaning back, the glow of your screen flickering across your face. Maybe there's a cup of tea cooling beside you, or the faint hum of an old radiator keeping time with your heartbeat. This is how history should begin, not as a lecture, not as a performance, but as a shared warmth in the dark. That's what this story is about, after all, warmth. Not the kind that burns or dazzles, but the quiet kind that keeps people alive when everything else has failed. When I first found the old records of Valmere, I didn't expect them to move me. They were brittle things, fragments of letters, trade ledgers, ritual notes scratched on bark and bone. But even through their faded ink, something glowed. There was a tenderness there, a defiance against extinction. People fighting not for wealth or conquest, but for the simple right to stay warm one more night. And I thought, maybe that's the purest form of civilization. It's strange, isn't it? We tell history as though it belongs to empires and kings, to monuments and decrees. But the real story of humanity is written in small rooms like this one, in breath shared between strangers, in the flicker of a hearth that refuses to die. I've spent years studying what the chroniclers called the frost of silence. They say it swept through the north without warning, turning entire valleys to ice. But what fascinates me isn't the cold itself. It's the way people responded to it, how they built meaning out of survival, how they turned necessity into ritual. If you close your eyes now, you might almost hear it. The creak of frozen wood. The wind pressing its face against a shutter. Somewhere, a mother hums to her child, not a lullaby, but a rhythm to keep her own fear from breaking loose. It's easy to imagine that world as primitive. But if you could stand there, in that hut, that moment, you'd understand what sophistication truly means. Not glass towers or polished speech, but the ability to endure without cruelty. I remember reading a passage from one of Valmere's late scribes. Warmth is the measure of mercy. It stopped me, because in that single line, I realized what our ancestors understood far better than we do now. They knew that warmth wasn't just temperature, it was trust. It was a social fabric, invisible but binding. They lit fires not only to survive, but to remain human. So tonight, as we step into their world together, I want you to imagine that you're sitting by that same hearth. The air smells of smoke and earth. The floor beneath you is packed dirt, cold but solid. Sparks jump like tiny spirits into the air, and the walls breathe with the rhythm of the wind. This is where our story begins, not in a palace, not in a city of marble, but in a hut so small that every heartbeat inside it feels communal. Outside, the valley is silent. Snow swallows every sound except the occasional crack of ice shifting on the river. There's no moon tonight, just a faint blue shimmer that seeps through the clouds, painting the world in ghost light. Inside, time slows. The villagers of Valmere lived by that slowness. They measured their nights not in hours, but in the distance between one log turning to ash and the next one catching flame. There's something deeply human about that rhythm, the way life narrows during winter until all that matters fits inside the circle of a fire. I've often wondered if that narrowing of life created a different kind of intimacy, one we've lost. Imagine sitting beside your neighbor night after night, trading silence and stories in equal measure, knowing that your warmth depends on their breath and theirs on yours. In that closeness, something ancient was born, a culture of shared endurance. They didn't think of themselves as poor or isolated, they thought of themselves as bound by the same flame. When I first visited the northern ruins, what remains of Valmere's border settlements, I carried with me a small recording device. I wanted to capture the sound of the wind moving through what used to be walls. It's almost musical, that wind, low, trembling, as if the air itself remembers. Standing there, I thought of how many lives had passed within those walls. How many fires had burned. How many nights had been survived not by strength but by tenderness. And I realized, history isn't a collection of dates. It's a pulse, sometimes faint, but always there if you listen closely enough. That's what I want you to do tonight. Listen, not just with your ears, but with whatever part of you still believes in connection. Let the noise of the modern world fall away, the notifications, the deadlines, the static. For the next few moments, there's only the sound of my voice and the echo of ancient breathing. Because somewhere out there, perhaps beneath snow, perhaps beneath sand, the same question has always been asked. How do we keep the fire alive? Every civilization, every generation, has its own answer. Some build monuments, some write scriptures, some pass down stories about gods of warmth and goddesses of frost. But beneath all that symbolism lies the same fear, that one day the flame will die, and we will forget how to rekindle it. That's why I tell these stories. Not to romanticize the past, but to remember its clarity. In a world stripped to essentials, people understood that every act of kindness, every shared ember, every offered blanket, was a declaration of survival. Maybe that's why this legend of Valmere stayed with me. Because it isn't just about climate or myth. It's about the fragile economy of care that holds any society together. When you hear what happened next, when frost became famine and strangers became symbols, you'll see how easily that economy can collapse. But for now, we stay in this moment. The calm before the shift. The air still hums with the smell of wood smoke and the faint tang of melted snow. Somewhere, a kettle hisses softly over the coals. A mother hums to her child. The wind scratches at the door, but the fire answers back. If you wish, whisper in the comments where you're listening from. I mean that. It comforts me to know that across centuries and miles, warmth still connects us, even if only through the fragile heat of imagination. I can almost see the glow spreading from screen to screen, from room to room. Like embers passed hand to hand across the dark. That, too, is a kind of ritual. So breathe slow. Let the night settle. The story will soon turn colder, but before it does, take this moment. The warmth we hold now is not just metaphor. It is inheritance. Because before queens learned to rule and servants learned to bow, before kingdoms rose or gods demanded worship, someone, somewhere, learned how to keep a flame alive when the world tried to freeze it out. That's where history truly begins. Before the frost, before the stories turned into warnings, there was rhythm. I can almost hear it still, the slow percussion of wooden spoons clattering against iron pots, the hush of wool being mended by tired hands, the soft laughter of children chasing one another around steaming cauldrons. That was Valmere before the silence, a small northern valley so distant from empire and war that people believed the gods had forgotten them. In truth, they had forgotten the gods first. What they remembered was weather. They knew the seasons the way sailors know the tides, by scent, by texture, by the way light changes the color of a mountain at dusk. When the smoke curled low and stuck to the rooftops, it meant frost was coming. When the ravens stopped calling, snow was already on the road. I often think of those early centuries as the age of predictability. Life was hard, but it was a difficulty that obeyed rules. Frost arrived, food dwindled, logs were rationed, but then the thaw came, and with it laughter, trade, weddings, and the sound of flutes echoing from hill to hill. In their songs, warmth was not luxury, it was morality. To keep your hearth burning was a sign of virtue, to share it, a sacred act. Children learned to breathe in rhythm with the fire, inhaling the smoke until they could tell its age and origin. Ash of pine is short-lived, their elders said. Ash of oak remembers you. It's strange how ordinary they were, and yet how advanced in the language of endurance. Modern historians call them primitive, but when I stood where their village once lay, I found evidence of cooperation that would humble most cities today. Food was stored collectively. Fire was traded like currency but hoarded by none. Even the smallest hut had an opening at its center, shaped to let smoke spiral upward in a pattern both functional and beautiful. The people of Valmere weren't a tribe or a kingdom. They were a rhythm, thousands of small acts of maintenance performed in unison against the cold. Their year began not with a date but with the first morning frost, and it ended when the last patch of snow melted into mud. Between those moments stretched a lifetime. Archaeologists found traces of their meals, dried roots, bits of charred grain, the bones of mountain goats carefully buried near doorways. There were no fortresses, no weapons of war. Only tools for building, cooking, and carving small figures from clay, gods, perhaps, or reminders of the living. I sometimes imagine what it felt like to live there. The mornings must have been slow, the air thick with smoke from 100 fires. Women's voices weaving through the fog as they sang to measure time. Men trudging into the woods for logs already marked by their fathers. At night, the village became a constellation of light. Every hut a star, every ember a heartbeat. From the ridge above the valley, it must have looked like the sky had fallen to earth and decided to stay a while. When I close my eyes, I can almost walk through it. I feel the crunch of frost underfoot, the faint sweetness of burning resin, the hum of a community small enough that everyone knew who had run out of bread, who was sick, who was expecting a child. They had no written laws, but they had memory, oral and communal. Each generation passed down rules carved not into stone but into behavior. How to bank a fire before sleep. How to keep it breathing through wind. How to trade warmth without losing it. One rule in particular appears again and again in their fragments. Never sleep alone while the wind still speaks. It wasn't superstition. It was science dressed in poetry. Human warmth could mean the difference between life and death. Two bodies together created enough heat to outlast the night. So the rule became ritual, and the ritual became sacred. Their calendar was woven into daily acts of survival. The first frost marked the Feast of Embers, a celebration of endurance. Families gathered outside, lighting small fires in circles, passing a single spark from one hearth to the next. The last family to light their fire was considered blessed, not slow. It meant the spark had traveled farthest and survived the journey. Even trade revolved around heat. They exchanged stones that held warmth longer than others, quartz and basalt, smooth and round from riverbeds. They believed these stones contained sleeping spirits of past fires, and to pass one to another person was to pass on part of your life. When I read the surviving testimonies, recorded centuries later by travelers who barely believed what they saw, I sense admiration beneath their skepticism. The Valmerians, one wrote, have little gold and less pride, but they possess a certain art. They make warmth behave like language. And it was language. Every gesture meant something. The way a host opened a door halfway instead of fully was an invitation to share heat, not space. The way smoke drifted from a chimney told neighbors if a family was safe or in need. Even their greetings were thermal metaphors. Your fire holds steady meant both. You are well, and I respect your strength. It fascinates me how such a world could vanish so completely. Because vanish it did, not through conquest but through climate. Before that winter, the one that would change everything, Valmere was alive with optimism. The harvests had been generous for 5 straight years. Children were being born faster than huts could be built. Trade routes had opened to southern markets, bringing metal tools and bright fabrics that glowed like captured sunlight. With prosperity came a new kind of hunger, not for food but for knowledge. The elders' rituals began to feel small to the younger ones. The idea of warmth as a spirit, something that needed tending and gratitude, started to sound quaint. They wanted mastery, not reverence. One of the last preserved songs from that time begins joyfully and ends in doubt. I can almost hear the hesitation in the rhythm. We bind the fire, we command its breath. We make it kneel upon our hearth. We are the keepers now. The flame obeys. It was the first time the word obeys appeared in their language. Before that, the flame lived with them. Now, it served them. That subtle shift, from partnership to possession, marked the beginning of their forgetting. It's easy, from the safety of centuries, to see the warning signs. The moment humans start to believe they own the forces that sustain them, the balance tilts. But they couldn't know that. They were simply tired of fear. I can't judge them. Every society eventually confuses comfort with control. We build systems, technologies, rituals, each promising safety, until one day the system turns brittle, and we realize it was safety that depended on us, not the other way around. When I read their final records, I sensed both pride and unease. They speak of new tools for keeping heat longer, of stones treated with oils that held fire for days. They praise a young craftsman who claimed to have found a way to teach flame to sleep without dying. The tone is celebratory, but beneath it, a silence grows. Fewer births, shorter winters, then suddenly longer ones. Animals disappearing from traps, rivers freezing earlier than anyone remembered. And still, they believed they understood the rules. I often think of the last summer before the change. Imagine it. Fields of barley swaying gold against the blue, children running barefoot through mud warmed by sun, smoke from cook fires twisting lazily toward a sky that seemed infinite. They must have felt invincible. The old gods quiet, the new tools humming. Warmth domesticated, predictable. The chroniclers who later wrote of Valmere's fall described this as the age of false peace. I think that's too harsh. It was simply the calm heartbeat of a people who didn't yet know how fragile their miracle was. When we say, they thought they understood the world, it sounds condescending, as if we know better. But do we? We too measure our stability by patterns we assume will continue: steady weather, steady markets, steady power. We too forget that the forces keeping us alive are borrowed, not owned. Valmere's people were not fools. They were human, brilliant, optimistic, and bound by the same illusion we cherish today. That nature will always negotiate with us because we've learned its language. But nature, like history, listens longer than it speaks. And one winter, it stopped listening. That winter came too soon. I know, because I've seen the frost lines buried in the soil straight and north of Valmere, pale streaks of crystalline dust that shouldn't be there until much later in the year. The archaeologists call it an anomaly. The villagers would have called it betrayal. By late autumn, the rivers should have still been moving, sluggish but alive. Instead, they froze solid overnight. Fish died beneath glass, their silver bodies trapped mid-motion. The harvest, half-cut, half-standing, blackened under a sheet of white that arrived without warning. At first, they mistook it for a gift. Early snow, the elders said, smiling into the sudden light. It means the gods are watching. But when the flakes didn't melt by morning, and the sky stayed low and heavy, a quiet unease began to ripple through the valley. I try to imagine the sound of that first week. The thuds of doors slammed against the wind, the dull ring of axes striking wood too cold to split, the murmurs of disbelief. Valmere had always known winter, but this was something else. The frost behaved like a living thing. It moved with intent, seeping into places it had never reached before, cellars, wells, even the breath of animals. Within days, the air inside the huts grew thin and brittle, and the smoke from their fires hung low, refusing to rise. Then came the silence, the kind of silence that has weight to it. It pressed on the chest, it filled the ears. People stopped singing while they worked. They stopped laughing. The usual sounds of life, the barking of dogs, the chatter of markets, were swallowed whole. When I first read the Chronicle of the Last Frost, I thought the writer was exaggerating. The air itself turned to glass, he wrote. Voices shattered when they tried to speak. It sounded poetic, symbolic. But the more I studied the physical evidence, the burn patterns on the remaining hearthstones, the thin layer of soot trapped beneath the frost line, the more I began to believe he was describing something literal. The fires were failing. Imagine it. You feed your hearth every hour, adding wood, then oil, then anything that burns, and still the flame refuses to live. You cup your hands around it, breathing until your lips crack, but the light dwindles to a faint red pulse. By morning, nothing remains but gray dust. The people of Valmere had no words for this kind of death. Their entire cosmology revolved around warmth as life. When the fires began to die, it wasn't just a loss of heat, it was the unraveling of meaning. They tried everything. They insulated their huts with mud and fur, built communal fires in the square, even slaughtered animals indoors for warmth. But the cold grew stronger, as if feeding on their desperation. There's a record of one family, the Mericks, who moved all their possessions into the smokehouse because it was the warmest structure in the village. They lined the walls with dried meat and hung blankets from the rafters. Within 2 days, the entire family froze to death sitting upright, eyes open, as if mid-conversation. When they were found, the meat was untouched. The chroniclers stopped writing after that. Pages end mid-sentence, ink smeared by what might have been tears or condensation. One entry remains complete, dated the 3rd night without flame. We whispered to the hearth as to a dying friend. It gave no answer. We slept in turns beside the ash. In the morning, the world was white inside and out. That phrase, white inside and out, haunted me. It described not just the landscape, but the people. Their skin, their eyes, their silence. By the 6th night, the valley's smoke had vanished entirely. No columns rising from chimneys, no glow from windows. From the ridge above, Valmere looked abandoned, a cluster of dark shapes swallowed by endless frost. And yet, amid that extinction, something unexplainable happened. It begins with the story of the stranger. Every culture has a version of him, the traveler who arrives when hope is gone. But in Valmere's case, the records are unusually consistent. 3 separate testimonies, written decades later in different dialects, describe the same figure. A cloaked man with eyes like embers, walking barefoot through the snow. No one saw him arrive. One moment the village was empty, the next, he was standing in the square beside the largest dead fire. His cloak was made of woven ash. His breath smoked, but not from cold, it glowed, faintly blue. He didn't speak, he didn't knock, he simply moved from house to house, leaving something behind, a handful of dust that shimmered like crushed stars. The first person to follow him was a widow named Elra. Her journal, preserved almost intact thanks to the cold, contains the only first-hand description of what happened next. He came to my door when the wind had stopped. I thought he was a ghost, for he made no sound. In his hand he carried dust that shone like moonlight. He cast it into my hearth. The fire took it greedily. I felt warmth climb into my bones as if remembering me. When she woke the next morning, the fire was still burning. Not wildly, but steady, a living orange heart. She stepped outside to tell her neighbors, and found footprints in the snow leading from door to door, fading toward the forest. By dawn, he was gone. What he left behind changed everything. In every house he visited, the same thing occurred. A single hearth burned brighter than it should have. The fuel lasted longer. The smoke rose clean and pale. People gathered in disbelief, holding their hands to the flame as though afraid it would vanish again. It didn't. The villagers called the substance ember dust. When mixed with ash and breathed upon 3 times, it seemed to coax the fire back to life. Some said it contained trapped sunlight. Others believed it was the breath of Elandra herself, the goddess of warmth. I've examined the archaeological samples myself, tiny flecks of mineral embedded in soot layers, unlike anything native to the region. The chemical structure suggests a compound capable of storing thermal energy far beyond what should have been possible with primitive tools. Was the stranger a traveler carrying a forgotten technology? A remnant of an older civilization? Or something else entirely? A myth born of collective relief? I can't say. But what matters is what happened next. The villagers of Valmere, having faced the death of fire itself, now found themselves holding a miracle they didn't understand. They divided the ember dust carefully, portioning it out like holy bread. Each family received a small pouch, enough to rekindle their hearth once. For the first time in weeks, smoke returned to the sky. Thin, trembling ribbons at first, then stronger, rising in unison from every chimney. The valley filled with the scent of burning wood and thawing earth. People wept openly in the streets. It was as if the entire world exhaled. But miracles have consequences. In the weeks that followed, warmth returned, too quickly, too powerfully. Snow melted in patches, then froze again, forming sheets of glass over the fields. Crops rotted beneath the ice. Livestock grew restless. Birds circled overhead, confused by the sudden shifts of temperature. And beneath the joy, a question began to whisper. What have we awakened? Elra's journal changes tone after that. Her handwriting grows uneven. The fire no longer sleeps. It watches. When I close my eyes, I feel it breathing with me. Some believed the ember dust was divine. Others feared it was a curse. The Council of Elders, a group that had ruled quietly for generations, split into factions. One wanted to preserve the dust as sacred. Another sought to study it, to reproduce it, to turn survival into mastery once again. History would prove that both were wrong. When I retraced the timeline, I realized how short the miracle lasted. 3 months. That's all. 3 months between the night the stranger appeared and the moment Valmere changed forever. Because after that, the fires no longer needed tending. They burned on their own, too hot, too long. The people rejoiced at first, thinking the gods had finally rewarded their endurance. But warmth without balance is just another kind of cold. In time, the huts grew stifling, then dangerous. The hearthstones cracked from heat. The air shimmered with invisible currents that made people faint. Children's toys left too close to the flame melted into the floor. And then, one morning, the fire in the council hall refused to die. They poured water on it, buried it in sand, covered it with iron. Still it burned, blue and silent. It was Elra's daughter who first called it the living fire. She said it breathed like a person and grew stronger when people argued nearby. From that moment on, nothing in Valmere was predictable again. When I stand among the ruins now, I sometimes think about that stranger. Whether he was real or imagined, his arrival marks the precise moment when faith became science and science became fear. The frost had been their enemy. But the thing they called warmth, that was what finally undid them. And in a way, isn't that always how it happens? We survive disaster not by learning humility, but by inventing control. The fires of Valmere would never go out again. But neither would they obey. That's where the next part of the story begins. In the uneasy glow between salvation and ruin. After the stranger vanished, Valmere did what all frightened societies do when confronted with the unknown. They built a system around it. Fear became method. Gratitude became governance. And I suppose, in that sense, civilization began again. When I walk through what remains of their central square, I can still trace the outlines of the pattern they carved into the ground afterward. A spiral of stone radiating from a single blackened hearth. It's strange to think that from this small place came a theology of warmth that would last centuries. But it wasn't faith alone. It was engineering disguised as devotion. They called it the keeping. Every evening, as dusk bled into the snow, a chosen family, known as the Ash Keepers, would gather the embers from the main hearth and distribute them across the village. The embers were wrapped in clay and straw, passed hand to hand like relics. In the morning, each household returned a small portion of their ash to the central pit, ensuring that no one's fire was purely their own. To outsiders, this might sound quaint, a ritual of sharing. But to the people of Valmere, it was a survival algorithm. By decentralizing warmth, they prevented any single hearth from consuming too much fuel. They balanced the energy across the valley. What began as spiritual duty evolved into a kind of primitive thermodynamic management, community heat distribution through ritualized exchange. I've read fragments of their daily ledgers, not written with numbers, but with symbols representing temperature and effort. The spiral marked time. How long the fire lived, how much ash was returned, how much dust, that mysterious ember dust, was used. It fascinates me how quickly superstition can mirror science, and how science, in turn, becomes ritual when people stop understanding it. The Ash Keepers soon became the most trusted, and feared, people in Valmere. Their task seemed simple, yet it carried immense responsibility. If a household's fire went out, the keeper who had delivered the ember was blamed. If too many homes burned too hot, the keeper was accused of hoarding the dust. The role was hereditary. Entire bloodlines became devoted to the stewardship of warmth. They developed chants, breath patterns designed to regulate the strength of flame. I've seen the marks carved into stones near the old hearths. 3 lines, then a spiral, then a single breath mark. According to oral accounts preserved in southern monasteries centuries later, these chants followed a pattern of controlled breathing, in through the nose, out through the heart. It sounds poetic, but perhaps it wasn't metaphor. Some modern researchers suggest the technique increased oxygen intake, fueling the small coals with exhaled carbon dioxide, a rudimentary but effective way to revive dying fires. To the people, though, it wasn't chemistry. It was communion. They believed warmth was a living spirit that could be shared but never owned. The fire breathes through us, one tablet reads, and we through it. When we forget the rhythm, the frost will return. That line was recited at every gathering, every birth, every burial. Fire became identity, but systems built on fear require constant maintenance. And soon, the ritual expanded. The Ash Keepers introduced the exchange of stones. Each household contributed 1 smooth river stone to a communal pit. The stones were heated daily in the central hearth and returned at night, still warm. Families placed them under blankets or pressed them against their chests while sleeping. It was a clever adaptation, heat storage disguised as spirituality. Children were told that each stone carried the memory of the day's sunlight. If a family's stone cooled too quickly, it meant someone in the household had spoken falsehoods or neglected generosity. Thus, morality and physics fused into one system. When I first studied their archives, I thought this was beautiful, almost utopian. But the more I read, the more I saw the trap hidden inside. Because once warmth became a moral currency, inequality followed. The Ash Keepers began keeping records of which families shared best. Those who offered extra ash or fuel were honored. Those whose fires burned weak were quietly shamed. Over time, warmth ceased to be a collective resource and became a symbol of virtue, and virtue, as always, invited hierarchy. A council was formed to oversee the rituals. They named themselves the Breath Circle. They claimed divine lineage from the goddess Elandra, though their power came from something far more tangible: control over the ember dust. No one else knew how to find it, or perhaps no one dared to try. The dust had become sacred, forbidden to handle except under ritual supervision. The circle rationed it carefully, distributing tiny amounts each winter while storing the rest in sealed jars beneath the central hearth. I've seen one of those jars, or what remains of it, in the northern archives of Saethem, far from its home. Inside, a residue still shimmers faintly when exposed to flame. I held it once under museum light, and for a moment I thought I felt warmth radiate from the glass. Perhaps imagination, perhaps memory. In Valmere, though, the effect was political. Whoever controlled the dust controlled survival. So the circle grew powerful. They declared that warmth was not merely a blessing but a covenant, one that could be revoked. Those who disobeyed communal rules risked exile, which, in that climate, meant certain death. The paradox was cruelly elegant. To preserve unity, they created fear. To maintain warmth, they threatened cold. And it worked. For a time, Valmere thrived. The winters, though still harsh, no longer broke them. The fires burned evenly. The population grew. Travelers from neighboring valleys began to arrive, drawn by tales of eternal flame. But every system that stabilizes too well eventually forgets its purpose. In the Ashkeeper's archives, discovered centuries later under layers of soot and clay, I found a curious shift in language. Early inscriptions speak of warmth as gift. She gives, we tend. Later ones use verbs of control. We command, we store, we measure. It's a subtle change, but profound. When faith becomes measurement, compassion becomes accounting. The circle began enforcing strict quotas. How much fuel each family could use, how many breaths of ember dust were permitted per week. Those who exceeded their share were branded, frosted, not yet exiled, but marked as spiritually cold. Children of the frosted were forbidden from marrying within the circle's lineages. Their fires were inspected nightly. The keepers claimed this was to prevent imbalance. Too much heat, they said, would anger the goddess. But beneath the theology lay bureaucracy. Warmth had become statistics. And yet, despite its rigidity, the system endured for generations. Perhaps because it offered certainty in a world that no longer obeyed its old seasons. Standing among their ruins, I find myself conflicted. Part of me admires the elegance of their invention, a moral economy built entirely around thermodynamics. But another part feels unease. How easily necessity becomes doctrine. How quickly collaboration turns into control. I sometimes wonder if that stranger, whoever or whatever he was, could have imagined what his handful of dust would become. He had offered life. They built an institution. Still, I understand them. When people face extinction, they build rituals not because they are weak, but because structure is how we make meaning out of chaos. Systems are simply stories we tell to keep fear at bay. Theirs worked astonishingly well. Too well. It tamed the frost but also tamed imagination. By the time later travelers reached Valmere, they found a society of astonishing order. Fires burned at equal strength in every home. Meals were synchronized. Chants echoed across the valley at dawn and dusk. There were no thieves, no wars. But there was also no laughter. A chronicler from Saethem wrote, "They have made perfection their prison." He wasn't wrong. Their obsession with balance meant no excess was tolerated, not in heat, not in emotion, not even in love. Marriage rituals were timed to the fire's rhythm. Childbirths were scheduled according to the breathing cycles of the hearth. Passion was considered dangerous. It produced too much warmth, too much imbalance. The goddess Elandra, once invoked as a figure of compassion, became a symbol of regulation. Her temples, simple hearth houses of stone, contained no idols, only perfectly measured flames tended by silent priests. The irony is unbearable. They built a religion to preserve warmth, yet it was the coldness of obedience that defined them. And still, somewhere within that mechanical devotion, the ember dust glowed, patient, waiting. Because systems, like fires, contain their own decay. They burned brightest just before collapse. When the next crisis came, it didn't begin with frost. It began with faith unraveling, one breath at a time. But that's for the next part of the story. For now, all that remains is this image. A woman kneeling before her hearth, whispering the breath pattern, in through the nose, out through the heart, as if she could still feel the goddess listening. Her child watches from the corner, clutching a small warm stone, its glow reflected in her eyes. That child's name was Mira. And she would be the last to remember the true warmth of Valmere, not the institutional flame of the circle, but the simple, human heat that once passed from one hand to another without asking who deserved it. I first found Mira's name carved on a hearthstone. It was small, no larger than my hand, a thin slate etched with a symbol of flame and a single word beneath it, Mira. The letters were shallow, hurried, as if written in secret. That's how I met her, not as a legend, but as a whisper cut into stone. The records call her Mira of the Ash, one of the last true healers of Valmere before the final burning. But the legends tell a softer truth. That she was born with skin warm to the touch even in winter, and that her breath could coax sparks from cold wood. I don't believe miracles easily. I've seen how time polishes ordinary kindness into myth. But the more I read, the more I understood why people believed. In a world where warmth was law, compassion looked indistinguishable from magic. Mira's life began where the system reached its most brittle perfection. By her generation, the Ashkeepers had become administrators, their faith replaced by formulas. They recorded everything: flame height, fuel rate, even the temperature of a newborn's skin at birth. The breath circle no longer knelt before the fire, they measured it. And yet, in that world of obedience, Mira refused to measure anything. She was born to one of the lesser keeper families, people responsible for maintaining the communal ovens used to dry herbs and roots. Her mother, a woman named Aerith, taught her early that warmth was not a substance to be stored, but a motion to be continued. "The fire isn't ours," her mother would whisper while turning loaves in the oven. "We just remind it that it's alive." Mira carried that idea with her, quietly, dangerously. She learned the chants, yes, but she also learned the spaces between them, the pauses where breath became silence. In that silence, she listened. To the creak of wood, the sigh of smoke, the strange rhythm of heat moving through walls. By 16, she was known for what the circle politely called unorthodox methods. She healed frostbite with herbs no one else used, warmed dying embers by placing her palms over them instead of blowing. They said she could hear the temperature of a room, sense when a flame was close to exhaustion. Her talent made her useful. But usefulness breeds scrutiny. The circle assigned her to the northern quarter, where the poorest families lived, those marked frosted generations earlier. It was punishment disguised as duty. Yet it was there, among the coldest homes, that Mira found the last living spark of what Valmere used to be. The frosted had little left to lose. They shared what warmth they could, without permits or quotas. Children played near the fires even when forbidden. Old songs still circulated in their gatherings, songs that spoke not of obedience, but of love and laughter and chaos. When Mira entered their homes, she didn't bring rules. She brought hands. I found a transcript of one of her recorded testimonies, preserved by a traveling scribe from Saethem who visited during the final winters. He described her as a woman of impossible gentleness, who treated warmth as though it were a wounded bird. He writes, "She knelt by a dying man's hearth and placed her palm upon his chest, the other on the ash. She whispered, and the air shimmered. When she rose, the man was breathing easier. The fire burned steady again. She asked for nothing." That was Mira, a scientist without a name for science, a priest without a temple. But in Valmere's rigid order, kindness was rebellion. The circle began to take notice. They accused her of manipulating the ember dust, of performing unsanctioned exchanges, of restoring fire to those deemed unworthy. Mira didn't deny it. She simply said, "If the goddess gives breath, I will not decide who inhales." That statement alone could have condemned her. But the circle hesitated. Too many people loved her. Too many lived because she had bent the rules. So they tolerated her, grudgingly, a useful heretic in an age that feared purity more than sin. And then came the night that changed everything. It's strange how history always turns on small domestic moments. The night Mira's hut burned wasn't marked by war or earthquake. It began with a mistake. a single candle left too close to a pile of drying herbs. Her daughter, Liana, was 5. She had her mother's gray eyes and an unshakable habit of asking questions no one could answer. "Why does the fire make noise?" she once asked. "Because it wants us to remember it's alive," Mira told her. On the night of the fire, the wind was howling. The frost had crept back into the valley's edges, and people were restless. Mira had stayed up late grinding herbs, preparing poultices for the sick. The candle tipped. The herbs caught. Within minutes, the walls were alight. Neighbors rushed to help, but the flames moved strangely, too fast, too eager. Some swore they saw the fire leap across the snow, chasing Mira as she tried to reach her daughter's room. They found her collapsed in the doorway, her hands charred but outstretched, as if shielding the child behind her. Liana survived, wrapped in a blanket soaked in river water. The hut collapsed moments later. The circle declared a divine intervention, the goddess reclaiming her servant. The frosted called it proof that the fires had become hungry, no longer bound by human breath. For Liana, it was simply loss. The traveler's chronicle ends with a quiet line. The child did not cry when they took her away. She stared at the ashes until dawn, then whispered something none could hear. What she whispered has been lost. But centuries later, a southern historian claimed to have found a phrase carved into a fragment of Mira's surviving oven stone. "Fire does not ask who it warms." I think that was Liana's doing, her first act of memory. After her mother's death, the circle took her in, partly out of guilt, partly out of fear. They hoped to train her, to shape her into a symbol of obedience. But Liana was not made for containment. Even as a child, she carried her mother's quiet defiance, that unsettling calm that comes from seeing what fire can both give and take. She stayed in Valmere until her 10th winter. Then the traders came. The frost had begun to move south by then, chasing food and fire alike. Merchants from Saethem arrived with caravans of salt and silk, exchanging goods for warmth, quite literally. They bought ember dust in sealed jars, calling it Northlight, and sold it as medicine to southern healers. Among their cargo was space for orphans, a gesture of charity that doubled as trade. The circle agreed to send some frosted children to Saethem, promising them education in exchange for peace. Liana was among them. The official record calls it the Covenant of Breath, a cultural exchange between the North and the Desert Empire. But reading between the lines, it feels like exile disguised as diplomacy. The last entry mentioning Liana in the Valmere archives is brief. "The child of Mira has departed. May her warmth serve elsewhere." I followed that thread south, through the trade routes carved into ancient ice, across dunes that once belonged to the sea. I imagined the little girl watching her homeland shrink into the horizon, clutching the single object she was allowed to keep. A small stone from her mother's hearth, wrapped in linen. The journey to Saethem took months. By the time the caravan reached the desert, the frost had melted from the wagons, replaced by dust and heat. Liana's northern pallor darkened, her lungs filled with sand instead of smoke. In the imperial archives of Saethem, she appears again, not as a child, but as a servant in the palace of Queen Sarai. The records describe her as a northern foundling with an unusual calmness of demeanor. No mention of her past. No mention of fire. But I've learned that history hides miracles in bureaucracy. Somewhere in that vast palace, among marble halls and perfumed air, a child of frost learned to walk barefoot across burning stone. I often think of her first night there. Imagine the contrast. A world where warmth was rationed replaced by one where it was endless, oppressive. The desert didn't give warmth, it imposed it. The air itself shimmered like liquid gold. Liana must have felt suffocated. Yet perhaps, somewhere deep inside, she also felt at home, because for the first time, she didn't need to guard her fire. The world was already burning. In Saethem, she would grow to serve in the Queen's library, the one place in the palace where the air was kept cool, shaded by thick stone walls. And there, surrounded by scrolls and silence, She found words for what her mother had only known through touch. Mira had believed warmth was a spirit. Liana would come to see it as memory, a code hidden in everything that lives. When I read the few surviving fragments attributed to her later life, I recognize her mother's voice rewritten in a new language. What we call fire is not hunger but remembering. It is the world recalling itself alive. Somewhere, I think, Mira would have smiled. But for now, in this part of the story, she remains in the ash, her daughter carried away by traitors into a world that measured warmth differently. And though centuries will turn their names into myth, I can still feel the pulse of them, two women separated by fire yet joined by the same defiant tenderness. One who tried to heal the world's burn, and another who learned to live within it. Saethem was another universe. I still remember the first time I read about it in the archives, how the ink itself seemed to glow as if infused with heat. The Empire of the Sun, the scribes called it, a place where even shadows carried warmth, and glass melted into art. When Liana's caravan arrived at its gates, the air itself must have felt alive, vibrating with cicadas and the pulse of distant drums. Imagine her stepping down from the wagon, wrapped in northern linen, her pale hair catching the desert light like frost refusing to melt. Around her, sandstone walls rising high as mountains, their surfaces carved with prayers to the sun. In Valmere, people whispered to the fire. In Saethem, they shouted to it. This was a world that worshipped illumination. Temples built to focus sunlight through mirrors until it became a visible blade. Gardens that bloomed only under controlled heat. Water channels lined with copper to keep it warm as it flowed. Every invention radiated mastery. Where Valmere had built a religion of survival, Saethem had built an empire of control. And within that empire, servants carried the weight of perfection. The palace was both heaven and furnace, corridors cooled with silk curtains, courtyards paved with tiles that shimmered like embers. The servants moved like ghosts between extremes, searing kitchens, chilled sanctuaries, the golden chambers of the queen. Liana was 12 when she entered that world. Officially, she was assigned to the household of the queen's scholars, one of hundreds of nameless attendants who swept floors and fetched ink. But history has a habit of noticing quiet people. Within months, her presence began to ripple through the records. The first mention of her appears in the logbook of a royal librarian named Mira. The northern girl asked permission to clean the ash basins. When I returned, the fires burned steadier than before. The scent of smoke had vanished. She said nothing, but the air felt gentler. Mira was no fool. He'd spent decades studying the sciences of heat, the geometry of flame, the alchemy of oils. He recognized something in the child's instinct that his calculations lacked, intuition born of hunger. So he kept her close, taught her letters, symbols, mathematics. And she, in turn, taught him silence, the discipline of listening before lighting. By 14, Liana could read the royal scrolls. By 16, she was advising the queen's attendants on the arrangement of braziers for ceremonial balance. The palace began to notice. Queen Sarai herself, a ruler whose power was matched only by her loneliness, summoned the girl one night to test her. The story survives in a fragment written by Sarai's physician. The queen commanded the fires of the hall to be extinguished. She bade the northern servant relight them without torch or oil. The girl took a single coal from the brazier of the dead hearth, breathed upon it, and said, "Fire remembers." The hall filled with light. Was it trick or truth? We'll never know. But that moment marked the beginning of their strange alliance. A queen born of desert flame, and a girl raised from frost. Liana was soon given a new title, Keeper of the Inner Flame. She oversaw the palace hearths, the forges, even the incense burned in temple rituals. What had begun as servitude became influence. But Saethem's court was not Valmere's village. Here, warmth was not shared, it was performed. Every glow served to glorify power. The queen's light had to shine brighter than all others. And yet, in private, Sarai began to seek the servants' counsel. Letters preserved on thin gold foil reveal their conversations, coded, almost philosophical. Sarai writes, "They fear my light will fade. Tell me, child of frost, how does one keep the sun from dying?" Liana's reply, "You cannot keep the sun. You can only remind it that it shines through you." Such words could have been treason. And yet, Sarai read them as devotion. The two women formed a bond that confounded the court, queen and servant speaking as equals, their silences filled with meaning. To the scholars, Liana became a curiosity, to the priests, a danger. She introduced small changes, harmless at first. Fires arranged in spirals rather than rows. Incense mixed with cool herbs from the northern trade routes. Within months, the palace felt different. The air no longer suffocated, it breathed. The court poets began to whisper of the frost within the flame, a mysterious balance spreading through Saethem's heart. I've read the records of the servants who followed her. They called her the listener. Unlike the overseers, she never struck them, never raised her voice. She moved among them with quiet authority, teaching them the same rhythm her mother once taught her, in through the nose, out through the heart. One wrote, "When she breathed, the fires breathed too." But influence is a dangerous element. Like heat itself, it spreads where it's not meant to. Soon, Liana's ideas reached beyond the palace. Artisans in the city began shaping pottery with spiraled vents to channel airflow. Northern pattern, they called it. Farmers adjusted their irrigation fires based on her designs. And in the lower quarters, whispers began that the queen's servant had rediscovered the lost wisdom of Maris, the ancient desert city said to have been ruled by women who balanced sun and shadow. That rumor changed everything. The servant queens of Maris were legend, half myth, half warning. They had ruled not through armies but through harmony, blending heat and coolness, power and restraint. When Saethem rose, it buried Maris' name beneath sand and silence. To speak of those queens was to challenge the empire's foundation. Yet Liana, unknowingly or not, resurrected their philosophy. She taught that warmth unshared became poison, that rulers must inhale as much as they exhale. To a people raised on conquest, it was revolutionary. I sometimes wonder if she understood the danger. Perhaps she did. But like her mother, she was incapable of pretending not to care. As her influence grew, so did envy. The priests muttered that she had bewitched the queen, that her northern dust contained forbidden spirits. Scholars accused her of corrupting sacred geometry with superstition. Still, Sarai defended her, publicly, fiercely. She called her daughter of balance and ordered her to record her teachings in the royal archives. Those scrolls, the breath codices, would survive long after both women vanished. I've read translations. They read less like commandments and more like confessions. Warmth is not power. It is the permission to exist. To rule is to remember the smallest hearth. The servant who tends the flame shapes the kingdom as surely as the one who sits upon its throne. For a brief, luminous decade, Saethem transformed. Temples opened their courtyards to shade as well as sun. Workers were allowed rest hours during the hottest days. The queen herself began to walk barefoot on the marble floors, saying it reminded her that even a monarch must touch the same ground as her servants. The empire flourished, art, poetry, trade. And at the center of it all stood a woman who had once been a child of frost, carrying the memory of fire that asked for nothing in return. But history has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Valmere's harmony had once turned rigid, Saethem's grace began to curdle. The priests, unable to challenge the queen directly, turned their anger on Liana. They claimed she was not merely recalling old wisdom, but reviving the heresy of Maris, a cult that had once dared to suggest the divine could dwell in ordinary people. To them, this servant-queen relationship threatened the sacred order of hierarchy. The sun could not share its light without diminishing itself. Whispers became accusations. Accusations became panic. I've seen fragments of the trial records, brittle parchment, the ink nearly erased by time. But one passage remains legible. She stood before the council, neither pleading nor proud. When asked if she consorted with forbidden spirits, she answered, "Only those that still burn within you." That answer sealed her fate. But that's the next part of the story, the collapse, the moral fall. For now, I linger on this image. A woman standing between fire and frost, her hands outstretched. The queen behind her throne watching with a mix of love and terror. The servants kneel. The priests whisper. The air trembles. She breathes, in through the nose, out through the heart, and for one impossible moment, the entire empire seems to breathe with her. That was the height of Saethem's brilliance. A world balanced on the edge of warmth and worship, ready to ignite. And when it did, the light would blind them all. I often think collapse never begins with hatred. It begins with unease, a whisper that something beautiful has grown too free. In Saethem, that whisper spread like heat through silk. At first, the warnings came quietly. Small notes between ministers, veiled sermons about humility. The priests didn't name Liana, not yet. They simply reminded the people that light, when unguarded, could burn. They spoke of the dangers of shared divinity, of forgetting the distance between ruler and ruled. I've read their rhetoric, the same words that surface in every age of fear. Order must be preserved, purity must be protected, balance must not become equality. Behind those phrases was a deeper terror. If warmth could belong to everyone, what use were those who claimed to control it? Liana never sought rebellion. Her writings show no ambition for power, no desire for thrones. But ideas have a way of outgrowing their makers. By the time the priests realized how far her teachings had traveled, it was too late. The breath codices had spread beyond the palace, copied by scholars, sung by servants, painted on market walls. People began lighting small hearths in spirals like those of Valmere, calling them homes of balance. Merchants burned incense in pairs, one hot, one cool, believing it would bless trade with fairness. Even soldiers carried stones engraved with her mantra, "Fire remembers." To the common people, she was a saint. To the council, she was contagion. The first act of censorship came quietly. Her scrolls were withdrawn from the library, for preservation. Then came the revisions, phrases softened, names replaced. Servant of light became messenger of the queen. The intent was clear. Remove her individuality, absorb her brilliance into the institution. But Liana would not disappear politely. When she realized her writings were being altered, she went to Queen Sarai. That meeting, recorded by a court scribe hiding behind a curtain, became legend. "Majesty," Liana said, "you cannot bury warmth. It seeps through the cracks." The queen replied, "And if the cracks swallow the kingdom? Then perhaps the kingdom was never strong, only sealed." It was the last conversation they ever had alone. From that night onward, Sarai changed. Perhaps she feared losing her throne. Perhaps she feared losing Liana. Love and power rarely survive in the same room. Soon after, an anonymous decree banned the northern practices. No more spiral fires. No more chants of breath. No more mention of the word balance in temple rites. Enforcement was swift. The servant houses were searched. Scrolls burned. Some of Liana's followers fled into the desert. Others recanted publicly, swearing allegiance to the true light of the queen. Still, Liana remained calm. She continued her work, teaching quietly in the lower kitchens, where the heat of the ovens drowned out eavesdropping ears. Her students called her Mistress of Ash, not as flattery, but as recognition. She was teaching them how to survive what was coming. And then, inevitably, came the accusation. A high priest named Varric claimed to have discovered evidence of necromancy, that Liana used the bones of the dead to mix her incense, that she spoke to the spirits of Valmere through fire. The charge was absurd but effective. It appealed to every fear the desert empire carried about the north, that its people trafficked in cold, in silence, in things that couldn't be seen or measured. The trial was spectacle. I've read the reconstructed proceedings. The Hall of Light, vast and echoing, filled with nobles, priests, and servants forced to attend. The air thick with the scent of burning oils. Liana was brought in barefoot, her gray eyes reflecting the flames around her. They questioned her for hours, about her teachings, her rituals, her origins. She answered simply, never defensively. When they accused her of invoking forbidden gods, she said, I know no gods. Only warmth and the lack of it. When they pressed her to confess her sorcery, she said, if sharing fire is sorcery, then all mothers are witches. Each answer struck like quiet thunder, impossible to refute, yet fatal in its clarity. At one point, a priest shouted, do you deny that your words have deceived the people? Liana looked around the room, at the servants, the guards, even the queen, hidden behind a veil, and said, I have not deceived them. I have reminded them, fire does not ask who it warms. Those were her last recorded words. The verdict was already decided. By dawn, she was stripped of her title, her writings sealed, her name erased from official record. The sentence: removal from the palace, to dwell in silence until the fire forgets her. No one knows exactly what that meant. Some say she was exiled into the desert, left with only a jar of water and her mother's stone. Others claim she was imprisoned beneath the palace in the vault of embers, where sacred fires were kept burning in eternal isolation. Whatever the truth, the next morning her chamber was empty. The guards swore no door had opened, no window disturbed. Only a faint scent of myrrh and smoke remained, and a mark on the wall, drawn in ash, a spiral. The court declared her dead. The queen fell ill soon after. Within a year, Saethem began to unravel. The climate shifted, droughts worsened. The canals that had glimmered like gold turned to cracked mirrors of dust. Crops failed, tempers flared. The temples, once brilliant with fire, grew dim, their fuel too costly to replace. Some said it was punishment. Others said it was balance. The same empire that had tried to own warmth now found itself consumed by it. Famine followed, then rebellion. The breath codices, once condemned, resurfaced in secret as guides to survival. Share breath, one line urged, for the world is running out. In a strange symmetry, Saethem began to resemble Valmere, a civilization facing extinction by the very element it worshipped. Queen Sarai's final decree was an act of desperation. She ordered that every surviving scroll of Liana's teachings be sealed in the royal tombs, for the day when heat returns to mercy. She died soon after, her chambers found cool for the first time in decades. Some say the fires around her bed extinguished themselves as if mourning. As for Liana, no trace of her was ever found. And yet, centuries later, explorers in the desert discovered a small cave halfway buried in sand. Inside was a single hearth, still intact. On the wall above it, drawn in soot, was the spiral of Valmere, surrounded by inscriptions in both northern and desert scripts. The translation is incomplete, but one line stands clear. I did not leave. I learned to become the flame. Was it her hand? Her followers? We can't know. But I like to think it was Liana's, the same calm defiance that had lived in Mira, written one last time for the world that had exiled her. The empire that condemned her eventually forgot its own name. The desert reclaimed its temples. The wind buried the palaces in dunes of gold. But the idea she carried, that warmth belongs to all, refused to die. Every few centuries it returns. In revolutions, in philosophies, in small acts of compassion that seem dangerous only to those who fear losing control. We see it every time someone shares what cannot be owned: knowledge, care, breath. That's the true moral fall. Not the destruction of Saethem, but the forgetting that followed. The slow rewriting of kindness into crime, of empathy into sedition. When I walk through those ruins now, the heat still radiates from the stones. I kneel, press my palm against them, and feel something deep beneath the surface, not rage, not grief, but memory. A faint pulse, like a heart made of ash, still beating. Perhaps it's imagination, or perhaps the desert remembers what we refuse to. That every empire burns not when its enemies attack, but when it forgets why it ever needed warmth in the first place. Liana's words still echo in that silence. Fire does not ask who it warms. Centuries passed. Then the desert shifted again. When I first arrived at the excavation site, a nameless stretch of ochre sand north of Luxor, the air felt oddly familiar. Dry, electric, humming with that same quiet expectation I'd felt once before among the ruins of Valmere. It was early morning, the dunes glowed pink, and the horizon trembled like heated glass. The archaeologists were already working when I reached the trench. Dust, laughter, the rhythmic scrape of brushes. They said they'd found fragments of a prayer, written in 2 languages, one northern, one desert. I knelt beside the unearthed slab, brushing away sand until the letters emerged like breath returning to a long dead body. The first line read, "We share warmth so the world remembers." I don't believe in coincidences. When I held that piece of stone in my hands, I knew I was touching the seam where myth and memory had fused. The scholars would later date it to roughly 900 years after the fall of Saethem. The inscription was signed with a name faint but unmistakable, Liana of Valmere. For a moment, the desert fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening. I've spent my life tracing ghosts, stories buried beneath centuries of forgetting. But this was different. Here was evidence that the line between queen and servant, between frost and fire, had not only blurred, it had survived. And in that survival, I saw something profoundly modern. Because the more I studied those ancient systems, the ashkeepers of Valmere, the priests of Saethem, the breath codices, the more I realized they weren't relics at all. They were prototypes. Every age invents its own rituals of warmth. We call them different things now: energy grids, social contracts, global economies. We trade electricity the way Valmere once traded embers, hoard oil the way Saethem hoarded sunlight. Our faith is data, our God is efficiency. But the pattern remains. Whoever controls the source of warmth, literal or metaphorical, controls the rhythm of survival. Not villains, systems. When the archaeologists sent their findings to the university, the experts dismissed the inscription as forgery. Too poetic, they said. Too convenient. But I've seen that handwriting before. In the royal archives of Saethem, faint under layers of soot and time. The curves, the breathing marks, even the spiral motif. Liana's hand. And suddenly, everything made sense. The north's frost and the south's fire weren't opposites. They were phases of the same story, one of dependency and control, resilience and forgetting. We like to think we've outgrown such cycles. But look around. Every skyscraper is a hearth now, glowing with electricity that must be fed. Every smartphone a talisman of captured fire. We live in Valmere's shadow, terrified of losing warmth, yet blind to how our keeping of it consumes the world. Our modern frost is climate, our ember dust is carbon. We bury it, release it, pray it lasts. And somewhere between comfort and collapse, we convince ourselves that innovation will save us, the same way the circle once believed their rituals would. The pattern holds. Discovery, dependence, devotion, decay. I sometimes imagine Liana watching from whatever realm myths inhabit, seeing satellites orbit like sparks, seeing cities burn with light that never sleeps. Would she recognize us? Would she pity us for building new temples to the same old gods, progress, profit, permanence? Or would she simply whisper, "Fire remembers"? When I lecture now, I begin with that phrase. Students think it's metaphor, a way to dramatize thermodynamics or human history. But I mean it literally. Energy never dies, it only changes form. Every joule of warmth we spend lingers somewhere, in the air, in the ocean, in the soil. The world keeps the receipts of our consumption. That's what the story of Liana and Mira really is, a memory system. A record written not in ink, but in heat. The parallels deepen the more I look. In Valmere, warmth was communal, survival through sharing. In Saethem, it became hierarchical, warmth as spectacle and control. Today, we oscillate between the two, global cooperation and individual competition, charity and greed, empathy and exhaustion. We are still trying to decide whether warmth is a right or a privilege. When I read the climate reports that predict another 2 degrees by mid-century, I can't help hearing echoes of those ancient voices. The villagers watching frost swallow their world, the desert queens watching their rivers dry. Extremes of heat and cold always mark the beginning of forgetting. And yet, there's hope in memory. The archaeologists unearthed more fragments, enough to reconstruct part of the lost Codex of Balance. The words are simple, but they carry a precision that feels engineered for our time. When flame forgets its purpose, it consumes. When frost forgets its mercy, it kills. Between them lies the breath, the space where remembering begins. It reads like a guide for modern living. Perhaps that's what Liana intended, not a theology, but an instruction manual for survival. Her mother had taught breath, she taught balance. The rest was left for us to remember when the world became too loud, too bright, too warm. I often wonder what she would think of the way we speak of energy crises today, as though the crisis were shortage, not inequity. We still ration warmth unevenly. We still measure compassion in currency. We still allow those who control the flame to decide who deserves its light. In that sense, Saethem never really ended. It became us. And yet, I find comfort in knowing that the story didn't vanish completely. Hidden in museum basements and forgotten archives, I've seen faint traces of her handwriting, looping and deliberate, like breath made visible. Each line feels less like scripture and more like a reminder. To keep warmth, she wrote, is to keep one another. That's the echo that matters, not the dust or the ruins, but the endurance of empathy through centuries of collapse. Because despite all our sophistication, our survival still depends on that same primitive exchange, the willingness to share what we have with those who lack it. Whether that's food, shelter, energy, or simple attention, the mechanism hasn't changed. Every time we choose connection over indifference, we rekindle Valmere's fire. Every time we speak truth to power, we echo Saethem's servant queen. And perhaps that's why these stories return now, in an age when the planet itself trembles between frost and flame. History isn't warning us, it's inviting us to breathe differently, to remember. When I left the excavation site, the sun was setting. The dunes glowed red, then gold, then a deep violet. The wind had smoothed away our footprints, leaving only the exposed stone of the inscription. I looked at the words once more. We share warmth so the world remembers, and realized that maybe this was never about gods or empires. Maybe it was always about us. The archaeologists packed their tools, the light faded, and for a moment, the desert cooled. I exhaled and watched the air shimmer, the brief miracle of warmth leaving the body, visible only when the world grows cold enough to notice it. That's what history is, really, exhaled breath turned visible by time. And if we listen, really listen, we can still hear them breathing with us. Mira by her hearth, Liana before her council, both whispering the same instruction across centuries of forgetting. In through the nose, out through the heart. Because the heart is the last hearth that never fully goes out. Night gathers at the edges of the room. Your screen glows like a small hearth, and my voice is only a thin ribbon of warmth crossing from my world to yours. We have walked a long road together, from a northern hut where a mother pressed a stone to her child's chest, to a palace of sun where a servant taught a queen how to breathe. I keep thinking about the first sound we shared, wind scraping wood. And the last, a whisper in the dark, fire does not ask who it warms. I repeat it under my breath as I pack away my notes, because certain lines are not lessons, they're reminders. The best ones feel like the body already knew them. If you listen closely, you might notice the room has changed since we began. Not the furniture or the walls, the air. Stories have a way of altering temperature. They pull heat toward attention. They cool the places where fear used to live. History is not a museum. It is a climate we co-create each time we choose what to remember. I have told you about Mira, who used her hands as lanterns, and about Liana, who turned memory into method. I have told you about Valmere's spiral of sharing and Saethem's stage of light. They were not parables of saints and villains. They were working diagrams of human need. Systems, not monsters. Incentives, not curses. The same old questions wearing new clothes. Who benefits, who suffers, who decides? The endings were not tidy. They rarely are. Valmere survived its frost but grew trapped inside its precision. Saethem dazzled with brilliance and then mistook performance for purpose. Both forgot the small thing that kept them alive in the first place. Warmth is relationship, not possession. We treated the symptom, not the cause. We tried to own the fire. It reminded us that it was only passing through. As the years carried their names into dust, the breath they taught survived. In through the nose, out through the heart. It sounds simple enough to stitch on a banner. It is not simple to live. Breathing like that, in policy, in design, in daily life, means you take in more than your share of noise and let out something calmer. It means you hold steady when the room grows hot. It means you remember the smallest hearth before you turn on the floodlights of a stage. Tonight, if your mind wants a moral, give it a practice instead. Feed the warmth that feeds others. Share what is easy to hoard. Credit, tools, time, relief. Build systems that reward circulation, not storage. When you design a room, a team, a company, a law, ask where the heat pools and where the cold drafts cut the skin. Move the vents. Open the doors. Place a stone where a body can rest. And breathe. Because breath is the quiet lever that changes everything without fanfare. It is the nearest form of mercy we possess that costs nothing and returns more than it takes. Our ancestor cities used it to keep coals alive. We can use it to keep one another from hardening into roles that turn neighbors into scenery. I keep a small stone on my desk. Smooth, river-born, the size of a closed eye. It is not from Valmere, no museum would allow that, but it serves. When a story runs too hot, when research loops into obsession, I hold it until the impulse to conquer a puzzle softens into curiosity again. The stone does not cool the room. It cools my need to own it. That difference is everything. Maybe you have your own version of that stone. A ritual that interrupts the reflex to hoard. A kettle you fill for someone else before you pour your own cup. A message you send before sleep that says, I'm here if you need a little heat. A window you open for the night shift of your mind. None of this will fix the climate or topple an empire. But systems bend through the tiniest hinges when enough hands learn the same rhythm. Sometimes people ask me whether Liana lived. I tell them what the fragments suggest. That she disappeared and did not vanish. That absence, tended carefully, became a school. People learned her shape by practicing her sentences. They found her in the design of an oven, in the pauses of a prayer, in the etiquette of a kitchen where the cook eats last. She is not where her body ended. She is where the warmth does not ask. I imagine Mira differently. I see her at the threshold of her burning hut, hands outstretched, choosing to become a bridge. No statue holds that posture for long, life does. Somewhere a child is saved by a gesture that looks like surrender and is actually engineering. The precise placement of a body between danger and breath. We forget to call that technology. We decorate its ruins and miss its blueprint. So, if you keep anything from tonight, keep this. History is not judging us, it is inviting us. Inviting us to build furnaces that remember the hands that stoke them. Inviting us to write laws that do not confuse brightness for goodness. Inviting us to craft jobs, families, cities that treat attention as a renewable resource. We can regulate power without starving mercy. We can measure without mistaking the ruler for the road. And when fear says tighten, ask the questions that loosen. Who benefits if the flame is locked in one room? Who shivers outside the doorway? Who chose the door? If you are a leader, warm the smallest corner first. If you are a servant, remember that tending is a form of authorship. If you are both, most of us are, breathe until your role widens enough to include another person's need. The line between queen and servant was never real. It was a temperature gradient running across a single house. The room around you has cooled a little while we talked. Screens do that. They borrow heat from the body and give it back as light. Before you go, reclaim some of it. Stand, stretch, refill your cup. Place your palm against the window. Feel how the night receives you without asking who you are. You are a brief warm thing in an old cold universe, and that is not cause for despair. It is permission to be kind. I will leave you the way the story began, with 2 rooms sharing one secret. A hut on the edge of a frozen valley, a queen's chamber open to desert wind. 2 worlds that learned, too late and then forever, that survival is a design of hands. 1 pair lifting a stone to a child's chest. 1 pair lowering a crown so it can hear the floor. When I close my eyes, the scenes begin to fold, and the breath between them becomes a bridge you and I can still cross. Keep the lights low for a moment after this ends. Let the silence have its turn. If you like, whisper where you're listening from, not for me, but for the map we keep making together, ember to ember, window to window. Fire does not ask who it warms. Neither should we. Thank you for the company, traveler. We'll continue soon. Next time, we'll walk the buried avenues of Maris, the city that tuned its life to the music of shade, and meet the women who ruled a desert with silence and song. Bring water, bring patience, and bring your breath.